In 2021, a shocking crime took place, turning what seemed like an ordinary family into the center of a tragic and horrifying event. It all started with a secret that no one expected would lead to murder. Margaret, a woman in her early 40s, had been hiding something dark in an affair with her 22-year-old stepson, James. While they kept their relationship hidden from the rest of the family, the truth was bound to come out, and when it did, it resulted in a night that no one in the family would ever forget. James, who had once been a hard-working young man with a bright future, found himself entangled in a dangerous relationship that blurred the lines between family and desire. Meanwhile, Richard, the unsuspecting husband and father, remained unaware of the storm brewing right under his own roof. But the lies couldn't last forever. On one fateful night, Richard discovered the truth, and what followed was a scene of unimaginable violence. This is not just a story about a broken family or a dangerous affair. It's about how a secret can lead to the darkest of consequences. Stay with us as we unfold the events that led to a brutal murder, forever changing the lives of everyone involved. Margaret never expected her life to take such a dark turn. She had always appeared as the perfect wife in her early 40s, married to Richard, a man of success and stability. They had built what looked like an ideal life on the outside. Margaret took pride in her home and her role as a stepmother to James, a young man who had come into her life when he was just a teenager. Now, at 22, James had grown into a hardworking young man with a love for cars and dreams of building his own future. But beneath the surface of their seemingly normal household, something much darker was brewing. It started with small glances, moments that seemed innocent at first but grew into something more. Margaret's feelings toward James were no longer just those of a stepmother, they were deeper, more complicated. James, who had always looked up to Margaret as a maternal figure, found himself drawn to her in ways he didn't fully understand. Their connection, once innocent, took a dangerous turn. The boundaries of their relationship blurred, and what began as secretive conversations and stolen moments soon became something much harder to hide. As the months passed, the affair between Margaret and James deepened. They both knew it was wrong, but they couldn't stop. Richard, oblivious to the growing tension in his own home, continued with his busy life. He worked long hours, and his absence only gave Margaret and James more time to be alone together. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and this one was no different. The weight of the lies and the guilt was starting to show in both of them. They knew it was only a matter of time before Richard discovered the truth. James was caught in the middle of a complicated situation. He loved Margaret, but he also felt trapped. His relationship with his stepmother was tearing him apart, and the guilt weighed heavily on him. He wanted to end things, to go back to how life used to be before everything became so complicated. But every time he tried to walk away, Margaret pulled him back. She told him that she needed him, that no one understood her like he did. It was a twisted bond that neither of them could break. On the night of September 15, 2021, everything came crashing down. Richard had noticed the strange behavior between Margaret and James for weeks, but he hadn't said anything. He wasn't the kind of man who jumped to conclusions, but something didn't feel right. That night, he decided to confront them. It was late, and the house was quiet. Margaret was in the living room, pretending to read, but her mind was elsewhere. James was in the garage, working on his car like he always did when he needed to clear his head. Richard walked into the room, his face tense with suspicion. Without any warning, Richard asked Margaret if something was going on between her and James. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that Margaret hadn't heard before. Her heart raced as she struggled to find the right words. She knew that this moment would come eventually, but she wasn't ready for it. She denied everything at first, but Richard wasn't convinced. He had seen the way they looked at each other, the way James had started avoiding him. He had pieced it together, and now he wanted the truth. As the argument escalated, James walked into the house, wiping grease from his hands. He could feel the tension in the air immediately. Richard turned to him, demanding answers. James froze, unable to speak. The truth was out, and there was no way to hide it anymore. The room was filled with anger and betrayal as Richard shouted at both of them, his voice growing louder with each passing second. Margaret, desperate to calm him down, reached out to touch his arm, but he pushed her away. In a fit of rage, Richard stormed toward the garage, determined to leave and clear his head. But as he reached for the door, something snapped in him. He turned back, his eyes filled with fury. Margaret and James stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do. In the heat of the moment, Richard grabbed the nearest object, a heavy wrench that James had left on the kitchen counter. Without thinking, he swung it at James, the force of the blow knocking him to the ground. James, dazed and bleeding from his head, tried to stand, but Richard was relentless. He swung the wrench again and again, the sound of metal hitting flesh echoing through the house. Margaret screamed, begging Richard to stop, but it was too late. By the time he dropped the wrench, James lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling around him. The house fell silent, the only sound being Margaret's sobs as she knelt beside James' lifeless body. Richard stood over them, breathing heavily, his face twisted with anger and disbelief at what he had just done. In that moment, everything changed. What had started as a forbidden affair had now ended in murder. The police were called shortly after, arriving to find the grisly scene in the kitchen. Detective Harris, a seasoned officer with years of experience in violent crime, was the first to arrive. He had seen his share of brutal murders, but something about this one felt different. The house, the family, it all seemed so ordinary. But as he surveyed the scene, it was clear that this was anything but ordinary. James was declared dead at the scene, his injuries too severe for any chance of survival. Margaret sat in shock, unable to speak as the paramedics attended to her. Richard, still in a daze, was handcuffed and taken into custody without resistance. The once quiet home was now the scene of a violent crime that would forever haunt those involved. This is where the story truly begins. What led to this moment? How did a family's secrets turn into such a tragedy? The events that unfolded after that night would reveal much more than anyone could have imagined. The morning after the murder, the house was eerily quiet, but the chaos of the previous night still echoed in every corner. The police tape blocked off the entrance, and the neighbors whispered in shock. No one could believe that such a brutal crime had taken place in their peaceful community. Margaret sat in the back of the police car, still trembling from the events that had unfolded just hours earlier. She couldn't make sense of it. One moment she was trying to calm Richard, and the next, her stepson was dead on the kitchen floor, and her husband was in handcuffs. Detective Harris, the lead investigator, knew this case would be complicated. He had worked on dozens of homicides, but this one felt different. It wasn't a random act of violence. It was a crime that had grown out of something much deeper, years of secrets and lies that had finally come to light. As he stood in the kitchen, looking at the bloodstains that hadn't yet been cleaned, Harris knew he would need to dig into the family's history to understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. Richard was taken to the police station for questioning. He sat in the interrogation room, his hands still shaking. He had never been a violent man, but something inside him had snapped. The reality of what he had done hadn't fully sunk in yet. He stared at the table, barely able to lift his head when Detective Harris entered the room. Harris sat down across from him, his voice calm but firm. Richard avoided eye contact, mumbling that he didn't mean for any of this to happen. He had just lost control. Harris didn't push him too hard, not yet. He knew that Richard was still processing what had happened, and he needed to tread carefully if he wanted to get the full story. But there was one thing that Harris needed to know. What had driven Richard to kill his stepson? The question hung in the air, but Richard couldn't answer it. At least not yet. All he could say was that he had found out about the affair, and something inside him just broke. Harris noted this carefully, already forming a timeline in his head. Meanwhile, Margaret was being questioned by another detective. Her story was shaky. She admitted to the affair but insisted that she had tried to end it. She spoke in short sentences, her voice breaking as she recalled the moment Richard picked up the wrench. Margaret wasn't a violent person, but she knew her part in all of this. She had kept secrets, and now James was dead because of it. As the day wore on, the detectives pieced together the details of what had happened. It was clear that the affair had been going on for months, and the tension in the house had been building for just as long. Richard had found out about it only a few days before the murder, but he hadn't confronted either of them until that night. He had hoped to find a way to fix things, to bring his family back together. But the betrayal was too much, and when he saw James, something inside him snapped. Back at the crime scene, the forensics team was collecting evidence. Blood patterns, fingerprints, and the murder weapon were all carefully documented. The wrench, still stained with blood, was placed in a bag for analysis. Harris knew that the physical evidence was important, but in a case like this, it was the emotional evidence that would tell the real story. He needed to understand why this family had fallen apart, and what had pushed Richard to commit such a violent act. The interviews with neighbors painted a picture of a family that seemed perfect on the outside. Margaret and Richard were well liked, and James had always been seen as a responsible young man. No one had suspected that there was anything wrong, but now, looking back, A few of the neighbors remembered seeing tension between James and Richard in the past few weeks. Little things: Richard not speaking to James when they passed each other, James spending more time in the garage than usual. But no one had thought much of it at the time. As Harris continued to dig into the family's past, he found something else that caught his attention. Margaret and Richard's marriage had been rocky for years. Richard had spent most of his time at work, and Margaret had been left to raise James. There were whispers of other affairs, though nothing had ever been confirmed, but it was clear that their relationship had been strained long before James entered the picture. Over the next few days, the detectives worked around the clock to gather more information. They spoke to James' friends, who confirmed that he had seemed distracted in the weeks leading up to his death. He hadn't mentioned the affair to anyone, but one of his close friends said that James had talked about feeling trapped in his home. He had wanted to move out, but Margaret kept convincing him to stay, promising that things would get better. The more Harris heard, the clearer the picture became. James had been trying to escape the situation, but Margaret wouldn't let him go. Richard, still in police custody, was charged with second-degree murder. His lawyer argued that it had been a crime of passion, a moment of uncontrollable rage brought on by the betrayal of both his wife and his stepson. But the prosecution wasn't going to let him off that easily. They painted Richard as a man who had known about the affair for longer than he admitted and had been building up to this violent outburst for weeks. Margaret, although devastated by James' death, was also struggling with her own guilt. She hadn't wanted it to end like this, but she knew that her actions had played a part in the tragedy. She tried to distance herself from Richard, refusing to speak to him after his arrest. But in the eyes of the public, she was just as much to blame as he was. As the investigation continued, Detective Harris knew that the case was far from over. There were still questions that needed answering. Why hadn't Margaret or James ended the affair sooner? Had Richard planned the attack, or had it truly been a crime of passion? And what would happen to the family now that one member was dead and another was facing life in prison? These were the questions that Harris needed to answer as he prepared to bring the case to court. The evidence was clear, but the emotions behind the crime were far more complicated. It wasn't just about the murder, it was about the lies, the betrayal, and the collapse of a family that had once seemed so perfect. This case wasn't just another murder, it was a tragedy, one that would leave scars on everyone involved. And as Harris looked over the final reports, he knew that the story was far from over. As Richard sat in his cell, awaiting his trial, the weight of what had happened began to sink in. His lawyer had visited him multiple times, advising him on how to plead, but Richard barely listened. He was lost in his own thoughts, replaying that night over and over again in his mind. How had everything gone so wrong? He had been a good husband, a good father, or at least he thought he had. But now James was dead, and Margaret had withdrawn from him completely. Their once stable life was shattered beyond repair. Margaret, on the other hand, was trying to pick up the pieces. She had moved out of the house after the murder, unable to bear staying in the place where James had died. She stayed with a friend, avoiding the press and the endless questions from people who wanted to know what had really happened. The guilt weighed on her every day, but she couldn't bring herself to visit Richard. She hadn't forgiven him for what he had done, and she wasn't sure she ever would. The trial date approached quickly, and soon the entire community was buzzing with anticipation. People wanted answers. They wanted to understand how such a horrific crime could have happened in a family that seemed so ordinary. The courtroom was packed on the first day, with reporters and curious onlookers filling every seat. Richard walked in, looking haggard and broken, accompanied by his defense attorney. Margaret was there too, sitting in the back, her face pale and expressionless. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. They painted Richard as a man who had lost control after discovering the affair, driven to violence by the betrayal of his wife and stepson. They presented the wrench as the murder weapon, showing graphic photos of the crime scene. The jury, made up of everyday people from the community, looked on in shock as the details of James' death were laid out before them. The prosecution called several witnesses to the stand. Neighbors who had heard the argument that night testified about the shouting and the sudden silence that followed. James' friends spoke about his troubled relationship with his family in the weeks leading up to his death. They described how he had seemed distant and distracted, burdened by something he couldn't talk about. But the most anticipated moment of the trial came when Margaret took the stand. She had been reluctant to testify, but the prosecution needed her account of the night. As she walked to the front of the courtroom, all eyes were on her. She sat down, nervously gripping the edge of the witness stand, trying to steady her hands. Margaret began by explaining her relationship with James. She admitted to the affair, her voice quiet but steady. She spoke about how it had started out of loneliness, how she had felt disconnected from Richard, who was always working late and barely present in their marriage. James, on the other hand, had been there, attentive, and they had developed a bond that crossed a line she never thought she would cross. She described the night of the murder, recounting how Richard had confronted her, how the argument had escalated, and how she had tried to calm him down. She told the court about the moment Richard picked up the wrench and struck James, how she had screamed and begged him to stop, but it was too late. The courtroom was silent as Margaret finished her testimony. It was clear that she was conflicted, torn between her guilt for the affair and her anger at Richard for what he had done. The jury watched her closely, trying to gauge her sincerity. The prosecutor thanked her and asked a few more questions before she was dismissed. Next, it was the defense's turn. Richard's lawyer stood up and began his cross-examination, trying to shift the blame onto Margaret. He argued that she had manipulated both Richard and James, leading them down a path that ended in tragedy. He suggested that Richard had been pushed to his breaking point, that his actions, while horrific, were the result of a deep emotional betrayal. Margaret, now visibly upset, defended herself, but the tension in the room was palpable. The lawyer pushed harder, insinuating that Margaret had intentionally kept the affair going, knowing that it would destroy the family. After Margaret's testimony, Richard took the stand. He was hesitant at first, his voice shaky. He admitted to everything: the confrontation, the rage, and the moment he grabbed the wrench, but he maintained that he hadn't planned to kill James. He described it as a moment of pure anger, a split-second decision that he regretted more than anything in his life. The defense painted Richard as a man who had been driven to violence by the actions of others. They emphasized his clean criminal record and his history as a hard-working man who had provided for his family. They argued that Richard wasn't a monster, just a man who had been pushed too far by circumstances beyond his control. As the trial progressed, the jury was left to grapple with the complex emotions surrounding the case. On one hand, it was clear that Richard had committed the murder. But was it premeditated, or had it been an impulsive crime of passion? The jury had to decide whether Richard's actions were the result of careful planning or a momentary lapse in judgment. In the final days of the trial, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury of the brutality of the crime, the multiple blows to James' head, and the fact that Richard had known about the affair for days before the murder. They argued that this was not an act of sudden rage but a calculated response to a deep betrayal. The defense, however, focused on the emotional turmoil that had led to the crime. They asked the jury to consider the human aspect of the case, to understand the pain and suffering that had driven Richard to act out in such a violent way. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the case was finally in the hands of the jury. They deliberated for hours, weighing the evidence and the emotional weight of the case. Outside the courtroom, reporters and spectators waited anxiously for the verdict. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom. The room was tense as the foreman stood and read the verdict. Richard was found guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence was swift. Richard was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Margaret, sitting quietly in the back of the room, barely reacted. She had expected this outcome, but it didn't bring her any closure. James was still gone, and her life was still in ruins. As Richard was led away in handcuffs, the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months settled heavily on her shoulders. The trial had ended, but the aftermath of the crime was far from over. For Margaret, there was no going back to the life she once had. The secrets, the betrayal, and the violence had forever changed her, and she would have to live with the consequences of her actions for the rest of her life. Even though the trial had ended, the story was far from over. For the community, the crime that had torn the family apart would remain etched in their memory. Whispers about the affair, the murder, and the trial still circled in hushed conversations. People who had once looked up to Richard and Margaret now avoided talking about them, as if the tragedy had cast a shadow that couldn't be erased. Margaret struggled to rebuild her life, but the weight of guilt and loss was too heavy. She had lost everything: her stepson, her marriage, her home. She had moved to a new city, hoping to escape the constant reminders of the past. But no matter where she went, the memories followed. She was haunted by her choices, by the part she had played in James' death. She often wondered what might have happened if she had ended the affair sooner, or if she had been honest with Richard from the start. But those were questions she could never answer. Richard's life in prison was one of quiet resignation. He didn't speak much to other inmates, keeping mostly to himself. He was no longer the confident, hard-working man he had once been. In the silence of his cell, he reflected on the night that had changed everything. He replayed the argument, the moment he picked up the wrench, the rage that had taken over him. It was a decision made in a split second, but it had cost him his freedom and James' life. Detective Harris had moved on to other cases, but this one stuck with him. He had seen many violent crimes over the years, but the complexity of this one left a lasting mark. It wasn't just a murder, it was the slow unraveling of a family, torn apart by secrets and betrayal. As he filed away the final reports, he knew that for everyone involved, the scars of that night would never fully heal. In the months following the trial, people who had once known the family tried to move on. The house where James had died was sold to new owners, who had no idea about its dark history. For them, it was just another home, a fresh start. But for those who had lived through the tragedy, the echoes of what had happened there were impossible to forget. Margaret, Richard, and James had become a tragic story that would be passed down in the community for years to come. Some would remember it as a cautionary tale about secrets and betrayal, while others would recall it as a reminder of how quickly life can spiral out of control. For Margaret, there was no escaping her past. The choices she had made would follow her forever, a reminder that some mistakes can never be undone. In the end, the story of Margaret, Richard, and James became not just about a crime, but about the destruction caused by lies and the cost of hidden desires. The ending wasn't just in the courtroom or the prison, it lingered in the lives that had been shattered by a single devastating moment. And as the world moved on, the pieces of their broken family remained, forever marked by the choices that had led to murder. The story didn't have a neat ending. Life rarely does. But for those left behind, there was nothing left but to carry on, each of them forever changed by what had happened.